No. Well, what happened was a group of Westerners, we know that the Templars were in Jerusalem digging down there at that time, and that followed up from the Templars is this guy named Kelly. Kelly is the hero of Prague, you need to know. You see, what had happened was that remember, John Dee, who later came to be called 007, because his letters to Queen Elizabeth started with "For your eyes only," which is 2 circles and a symbol for her eyeglasses. 007. That's the origin of the story. True history. Because he was the Einstein of his day. He had the largest library in Europe. He was the best mathematician of his day, and he was the advisor of the Queen, and he was 007. Well, because he spoke probably more languages than anybody on Earth, and had the largest library on Earth at his time, he basically one day said, you know, this is a little boring. I'd really like to talk to the angels, because everything down here is actually incomplete. Let's put it that way. And I'm getting up this website, Science of Alchemy, here to show you some of these pictures. So, in answer to his request, one day an Ophanim angel knocked on his window and handed him a green stone called the show stone, which you can still see in the British Museum today. And if you have a decent amount of clairvoyance, you can look inside and see the plasma residues, shadows of charged fields, called the origin of the alphabet, right inside there. And the shape of those charged fields, if you examine the shape of what's in there, you see these letters called Ophanim, Enochian, the origin of magic, Table of 64, long story, excellent physics. The problem was, the angels were trying to tell them how they assemble bodies. How does an angel have bodies? Well, if you ask any physicist, it's quite clear. You see pictures of interstellar plasma clouds which look like angels, and if you know what holds them together, centripetal force, hint, hint, and if you can enact the symmetry of donuts to make the forces centripetal, you as an angel can have a plasma body. And that alphabet is called Ophanim Enochian, which is a hypercube, really. The problem was, John Dee wasn't that clairvoyant, but Kelly was. So Kelly knocked on John Dee's door, says, I can read that. And sure enough, they spent X number of years, and they figured out the highest form of magic on planet Earth today. And it's true with Vincent Bridges and others. I have seen plasma storms the size of continents called by rituals involving those letters. And that kind of magic is not evil, it's not mysterious, it's simple, pure physics, and it is essential. In fact, the elementals regard us as drunk because we don't do it. So, the point is that Kelly and John Dee hooked up, and they had this whole Ophanim Enochian story, which is not the story we're telling today. But it's actually the physics of how you create, by a series of rituals and visualizations, a large plasma storm. You know, even the Druids knew that if the ritual was successful, you blow the doors off the church. The physics is because the change in air pressure is centripetal. It's not a mystery. So anyway, John Dee and Kelly were hired by Queen Elizabeth. You can imagine why. Because Queen Elizabeth was broke, and John Dee was her favorite spy. So John Dee's primary job, aside from predicting the future and a few other messes for the Queen, his primary job was money. And so he had promised, with the help of Kelly, that they could do a little gold making. There's gold in them, our hills. Problem was that they were running out of something. What were they running out of? When Kelly had knocked on John Dee's door originally, he had a small amount of this white powder in a little box from the ground up stone called a projective powder. If you take a small amount of that white powder, the philosopher's stone, and now I explain to you the physics. It's the right kind of capacitor that makes the right shape of electric field. And you wrap that in a little bit of wax, which is a wetting agent, so it looks like a grain of rice, and you drop that into properly heated mercury. Remember, the mercury thin film, the mercury has the same atomic geometry as gold. You just got to move an electron. It's pretty easy, actually. And this is the physics of biologic transmutation, you know, Kevlar and all that stuff. Anyway, and you get gold. The problem was that they ran out of the powder. What do? Then they heard a rumor one day that the streets of Prague are lined with gold. I mean, with meteors. I mean, with fractality. I mean, with alchemy. I mean, I think we need to go to Prague. Okay, so John Dee and Kelly said, off we go. Besides, I think King Rudolph over there will help us, because he's into alchemy. So off they go. So here's where they arrived. This is called Bohemia, otherwise known as Prague and Bohemia. And the original design and magnetic map of that place is a rose. And in the center of there, we lucid dreamed. It's very good for lucid dreaming, I must say. So, and we now know why. This needs to be a magnetic map of your bed for the same reason. So, when they got to Prague, they discovered what they were looking for. Not only was King Rudolph highly enthused, he was also enthused in beating the pants off the Catholics, because King Philip of Spain was nuts and everybody knew it. And he's building this damn armada and the world's in trouble, right? So Rudolph and Elizabeth agreed on at least one thing. So here is what Dee and Kelly found on the streets all over the place in Prague. They found a replacement. They found the green stone. There's a book called The Green Stone, by the way, by Squires and Verlag, and it's about the Magdalene mysteries, and the parallel is interesting. But the point we're going to make is that there's a certain kind of stone in Prague, otherwise known as Vitavine or the bottle stone, Boutte stone from bottle, others as sky charms. And this stone later came to be called, in the literature, the Grail stone. That very stone. Yep, indeed. So there it is, all over the streets of Prague, because how did that place get to look like a rose in the first place? A meteor! You stole my show. So, yep, that's how we got a Grail cup over there. And so this remains of that meteor, this little moldavite stone's all over the streets. If you pick the right ones and grind them up in the right kind of powder and play the alchemy magic. So meantime, the Pope got word of what's going on over there in Prague, and he was upset. He was pissed. So he sent a letter to King Rudolph that says, basically, I'm going to excommunicate you and your whole country if you give one more dime to that Dee and Kelly guys, because they're the devil. So King Rudolph came up with a plan. He said, well, I'm going to sneak them off to my country estate where nobody knows where they are. So off Dee and Kelly go. It turns out the tower that King Rudolph put them in was at the center of a giant magnetic pentagram, just like Saint-Remy and Rennes-le-Château, sometimes called the Holy Grail. So that's where the kind of pentagram where Nostradamus worked. That's a kind of pentagram called City of the Dead. It's a kind of pentagram called Holy Blood, Holy Grail, because it is centripetal force. So the magnetic pentagram there made it easier for Dee and Kelly, and sure enough, they gathered this whole scientist of the kingdom. They stuck the stone in the cup, and they did the shtick, and all the king's officers were present, and it's historically documented and proven that the best scientists of the day in both Prague and England proved that the gold they made was the most pure gold they'd ever measured in history. And then they sent the cup back to Queen Elizabeth, and she was mad, 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 mad. Here it was, her spy that had been on her payroll goes over there and starts making the gold for Rudolph, and she don't get any. Ooh, was she pissed. So what she did is highly interesting. Remember, the Armada's coming, and whoever don't beat them is toast. So all the Protestants of Europe are about to get dead. So there's a high pressure on here, and you need money if you want to defend. So what Queen Elizabeth did was she had blackmailed a certain family called Guilliamus Shakespeare, otherwise known as William Shakespeare. His family was in trouble with the Queen, but he was the best writer and articulate spy she had left. So basically Shakespeare has called the court and said, you're going to go be my spy or your family's toast. He didn't have a choice. Off he goes to Prague. And there starts showing up Shakespeare in John Dee's extensive, detailed, historically well-documented notes under the spy name of Francis Garland. So if you research in history, you find all of the episodes of Francis Garland in John Dee's notes perfectly interpolated with when Shakespeare disappears from England, Francis Garland shows up in John Dee's notes, back and forth. It's perfect symmetry. And then Francis Garland emerges from John Dee's notes for a little while, and Shakespeare publishes the next play. Back and forth. It's beautiful timing. So he's extensively documented historically that the guy called Francis Garland in John Dee's extensive notes is William Shakespeare. The will that shakes the sphere. Are we shaking our sphere today? Yes, indeed. So, as they said, oh, what happened then was rich. Garland was the name that Elizabeth gave to all her spies. There's a bunch of people named Garland. It's like lend over, bend over, rolled over, and no, the Garland brothers, because there's a bunch of rose garlands in a famous picture that was the most famous picture of Rudolph and Elizabeth. A garland of roses. And what does a fractal look like? A garland of roses. So Shakespeare shows up in Prague, and he's very expert at making notes. And he's sitting there writing and observing that basically Dee and Kelly are crazy. They're nuts. Talk about ungrounded New Age woo-woo. Excuse me very much. These kids had a few troubles. Let's not say, the heroes of history are klutzes. Let's be clear. And Dee and Kelly are some of the heroes of history that are klutzes. And Kelly's story is so extreme. He's there in Prague, and like King Rudolph is there willing to give him anything. But finally, Rudolph puts Kelly in jail 3 times, cuts off his ear and both legs eventually, because Kelly won't tell him. Kelly actively chose death rather than to reveal to King Rudolph how to do alchemy. It's an interesting story. They say ultimate power ultimately corrupts. Kelly believed that. At any rate, so sure enough, Shakespeare gets to Dee and Kelly and learns the real physics of alchemy. And it's also historically documented how he saw the politics of Italy and learned how to write his plays. All this perfectly fits of what happened to him while he was in Prague. It's a cool story, and Vincent tells it beautifully. The point is then to understand now more deeply the physics of what's happening in the plays. And this is going to lead us to the concluding part of this segment, which is the true psychology of alchemy. Group mind fusion experience. How does this happen? Da, da, da. The global one mind experience. What's the physics? It is the same as the physics of fusion, which is the same electric field theory we've been discussing all day. So how are we going to take Shakespeare's lesson in Prague on how they made gold to learn how to create a one mind experience? So, first of all, what we do know is that when you jitterbug the cube octahedron, which is the shadow of the hypercube, you get the physics of superconductivity. Cube octa, icosa, dodeca, octa, and tetra. But that jitterbug specifically is the spin path right there, where if you zap a gold thread or a DNA thread with amperage called kundalini, at that moment you make a superconductor. It's very measurable. And the reason you get a superconductor is because the distance to center there is golden ratio, phase conjugate, physics of superconductivity. And Nassim is agreeing with us on that. So this ability to jitterbug the shadow of the cube octa, which is an octahedron, became the design of the Shakespearean theater. Why? Let's look at Midsummer Night's Dream. Midsummer Night's Dream is the play most literature analysts start with when they say Shakespeare is all about alchemy. Now, let's think what's happening in Midsummer Night's Dream. Something is causing the water vapor droplets to precipitate precipitously. It sounds a little precipitous, doesn't it? So, what is causing the water vapor to form this mist in the Midsummer Night's Dream? Well, let's see. If you watch a child focus on a cloud, you notice there's a hole in the cloud. The physics is because the child made a centripetal electric field which teaches the water vapor droplets how to share, called crystallize, the physics of Christos, how to perfectly share. So when the water vapor droplets learn how to touch, precipitating precipitously, as it were, is this mist. And in the mist, remember that the plasma vapor, which clairvoyants see, becomes more visible because there's a substrate there to enable compression. It's a whole lovely story about alchemy. That's the beginning of the story. Plus there's symbolism there, but we want to look at the geometry. The geometry involves knowing something about the nature of emotion. Now remember, in a Shakespearean play, let's take Midsummer Night's Dream. I believe there are 4 couples. You know, we have the cube octahedron, we have 4 couples. One couple does love, the other does hate, the other does anger, and then one does fear, and then one does joy, pride, awe, anger, pity, fear. Okay, so you got these emotions, and you open the screen door over here, and then you experience one emotion. Close the screen door, open the next one. And this is called consumed perspective, e pluribus unum, setting up the symmetry for centripetal fusion. At the beginning of the play, you think, well, they're stupid, they're stupid, they're stupid, and they're stupid. But at the end of the play, you think, oh, I feel for them, and I feel for them, and I feel for them, and I feel for them. Why do you feel for everyone as one at the end of the play? That's the physics of alchemy. That's the psychology dynamics of human fusion of plasma. And what makes plasma able to fuse? It's the physics of Tantra, it's the physics of emotion, it's the symmetry of the sequence of emotions that makes human living charge, plasma bubbles become centripetal together. Fusion. So here is the physics of emotion. We know exactly the wave shapes of the emotions Shakespeare was writing about. They're well documented. If you take the emotion of love, for example, the pressure wave that says I love you in a squeeze or a touch or a violin string is the same. It's a pressure wave that reaches point of maximum pressure, 0.618. So literally, if you squeeze someone to say I love you, you're actually creating fusion. Which is why she should say she feels a tingle in your DNA, in her DNA, when you're finished squeezing her. Because the stricture has gone centripetal. So this is the physics of the possibility of fusion, so that if you experience the sequence of emotions in the right order, from the right point of view, so that you can embed and implode and fuse and become centripetal as one. This is the process of enabling the process of in Lakesh, I feel for you, you feel for me, I am another you, you are me, I am you. This is the actual physics of Tantra. This is the possibility that you are a plasma field, and you are the centripetal nature of that field. And the last moment before marriage is the most difficult one because it's called siege perilous in the Grail Mysteries, because the 2 plasmas are just ready to fuse, and there's that explosive, implosive, well, it's either all or nothing now. Plasma fusion. But if you can experience fusion, you gain that inertia and the field becomes larger. And that's called oneness. That's the reason that Shakespeare is called the psychology of alchemy, because it's actually the physics, what he learned about how to arrange the sequence of symmetries to make centripetal forces, how to make a black hole, how to make alchemy, how to make human fusion possible. So what happens in a Shakespeare play, actually, is that you've seen a series of couples go through the archetype of all human emotions. And if you open your eyes, close your eyes, next emotion, next emotion, next emotion. You know how that works? In physics, it's called the Templar origins of filmmaking. There's an old book, I can't find it, it's called Flicker. And in the book Flicker, the Templars learned that if you open and close a sequence of images at a certain speed, the human eye will experience what's called visual fusion. Visual fusion. And visual fusion is the possibility that you're seeing a sequence of separate images, but if they happen just fast enough, suddenly your eye will fuse those images together and you will see oneness. That's the origin of Templar filmmaking, and public relations. No. And media mind control. But it is actually taught at the Disney school about visual fusion. And that fusion rate is related to golden ratio. It's a lovely story. But the point here is that that opportunity to see a sequence of images and your eyes fuse them into one applies to seeing a sequence of emotions. So let's apply this to your soul group. Remember, we're saying that if you don't get your plasma through the sun, you're toast. Best way to get your plasma through the sun is a soul group that does bliss together in order to learn to lucid dream together. Critical inertial escape velocity for plasma. Good shaman always see through the sun like it's an eyeball. So how do you find the soul group and start steering the boat? Well, the physics is you get together and you have dinner together, and you do yoga. When you do yoga, and then you do dinner, yoga, then meditation, then dinner, and then you cry for each other. Everybody tells their story, and everybody else cries. You know how it goes? And if you do that for years, eventually notice that you can lucid dream together. And that's a good sign. Mother Nature's silver seed through a new hole in the sun, new home in the sun. And so this ability to fuse as a group depends on being able to feel so much for another person's emotion or their pain that actually this is the beginning of the fusion process into a one-mind experience. So any questions on this connection between alchemy, physics of gold, and the psychology of fusion? Comments? Thoughts? Oh, yes.
And speaking about that emotion, I have such a, I don't know, I just don't want to be around people with emotions that are jealousy and anger, and it's really hard for me to be in that place of compassion that you speak about.
Hard for all of us. Yeah. And you know what they say is you only fall in love with pure intention, but if you waited for pure intention, you might never fall in love because...
I'm talking about just friends even.
Yeah, it's true. But what we need now is to recognize that it's not helpful to fall in love with a metal building because your plasma cannot inhabit something that's not fractal, which is related to the physics of why a person can receive love only to the extent that they love themselves, actually. So the point is that it is appropriate to actually, seek for pure intention. Because effectively, it isn't really a person that you seek. What you seek is a way to the center of the tornado, the heart of the sun, the heart of the fractal, the core of the collective mind, which is the physics of this electric field. And that is the ultimate steering wheel. So it's a way of saying you're seeking pure intention. My way of translating that has been to seek pure principle. So as I go around in life, I say, is there pure principle over there? And every time you think about pure principle, your hair stands up, you attract charge, you get the Jimmy Willie warm fuzzy, and if you do pure principle continuously, you never die. So the physics is actually that death was only invented to teach us to stop storing unshareable emotions. So you're seeking a shareable emotion. So is everyone. That's beautiful. We just have to be gentle with each other as we all learn that we learn best by seeing it in each other's mirrors.
So therefore, to be fractal, I don't have to express all of those emotions.
Well, it's like when they said your best debt to your parents is to be all you can be. It doesn't mean that you have to go around saying I love everybody, but it does mean that the more you think kind thoughts about everyone, the more you attract charge. And you don't even really need to say anything.
The one that introduces, if we go back to Shakespeare, we go back to the Midsummer Night's Dream, the one that introduces all the opposites together is Puck. Puck. And Puck is the catalyst.
Puck is
and
this.
Brings them together. So that you resist is brought to you by Puck. And
then I want to avoid those people.
Yeah. Whereas if you relax enough, it all will playfully come to you. But you do want to, at the same time you relax, you're relaxed in focus to the pure principle of actually what your sole purpose is. So it's a beautiful grail quest that you describe. I must say that just before we take our break, I forgot to tell you the rest of the story. The website where we talk about this, galactic history of DNA is goldenmean.info/the rest of the story. And the rest of the story here is that. So, Dee and Kelly and Elizabeth had 1 year to plan for when this armada was coming. And Rudolph had been raised in the court of King Philip of Spain, who was raising the armada, and he was aware that King Philip was insane and that his favorite thing to do was toast Protestants for breakfast. So he was quite aware that the world was toast if the armada won. So Rudolph and Elizabeth and Dee and Kelly had an agenda. They needed to fix something. We got a couple thousand ships coming over here to toast England, and this is a problem for everybody. So they figured, they worked on this for a year, and they planned, they put, if you see the geometry of Prague again, first I want to go back here and show a few more of our pictures just so we get the background here to finish our story. That's Dee, and that's Kelly, and that's Vincent Bridges. This is one of the magazine articles, Shakespeare and John Dee by Vincent Bridges and Teresa Burns, his co-author, and Teresa was with us in Prague. This is all goldenmean.info/science of alchemy. And this is Sir Philip Sidney, who was the spy master for Queen Elizabeth. This is the manuscript here that Kelly sold to Dee, called the Voynich manuscript, which in the Voynich manuscript you have a detailed map of the galaxy before telescopes were invented. Very similar to what's on the ceiling at Dendera. So here it is long before the invention of telescopes, and you got a map of the galaxy that's relatively accurate. How did they get that? Have you met any good lucid dreamers lately who have been through the sun? They can tell you how to navigate. This is called Luke Skywalker. All right, so this was what Dee and Kelly was working with, a Voynich manuscript, which was a manuscript of how to navigate when you die. At any rate, in Prague, the point I wanted to make is that there's, you know how they have the 7 hills outside Prague, the 7 hills of Rome? Well, there's 7 hills outside and 5 hills inside Prague. And so they had the 7-5 symmetry, which is the Ophanim sigil, laid out right in the city of Prague. And they had the old rabbis who invented golem making, and they had John Dee and Kelly who invented Ophanim Enochian ritual. And they got together and they made trouble. And the trouble is called the Tempest. And what they did is they invoked the Ophanim. Remember, Ophanim are these interstellar bodies of plasma who make storms the size of continents. I have watched it happen. I know that it's real, and I know the physics, and it's not a mystery. In fact, I'm telling this story because this is how to steer the solar wind. It's an Introduction 101. So what they did is they did the Ophanim Enochian. The Ophanim Enochian are basically saying, if you conduct living plasma in these sequence of symmetries, you will make a giant wave of centripetal force. Now, if you study the detailed meteorologic history from the direction and angle from the storm that took out the Spanish Armada, you will find it came from the North Sea in a way that's never happened before or since in history. And the geometry of that wind was such that the Spanish sailors' descendants still live on the west coast of England today because they never got home. So they called a storm the size of a continent, on time, on schedule, by a plan, for a need. And that is a good lesson for today, Mr. Shakespeare and the Tempest. Thank you very much. So I think we'll have about a 10-minute break, and then we'll have Danny Schreiber, and then we'll have questions. Thank you. Thank you. And Leyland's group is, what's your website, Leyland?
Oh, we don't have it, but it's organic crop protectants. You go to Bunnings and see 14 of my products, all the organic products.
Organic crop protectants. You'll see them all at Bunnings.
ACP.com.au. www.acp. But this I'm about to retire at the end of this month, just to concentrate on this.
So he's migrating from the organic crop protectants to the Ormies.
That's my company. I'm starting to find shares now, and I'm concentrating on this.
Thank you, Leyland.
Excellent. Thank you.
So, Danny Schreiber of Starseed.co.
Thank you. So the reason I've put this slide up to start is because a lot of what we're looking at is actually a shift in perspective. It's the understanding that, you know, the way in which we see the world, as we change the way in which we see the world changes. And so it's like when we look in the mirror in the morning, if our hair's out of place, we don't try and comb the reflection in the mirror because that would be foolish, right? But this is exactly what we tend to do when we try and change the world. So change is really an interesting metaphor, metamorphosis. And of course, politicians today have grabbed this thing, change, and Obama and Julia Gillard, they're all using change to get elected. And of course, they're talking about externally changing things, you know, up the war on drugs, up the war on terror. But war in itself creates more of the same. And so most people in this room probably understand this concept. So what we were taught at school, which was if you don't like something, change it, may not be as applicable if we try and actually change the reflection. If we change ourselves, the reflection magically seems to change. So how this relates to the way in which we interact with each other and the earth and our communities is very important. And in fact, in these times, as we see a collapse of space-time, if you'll call it, or the end of time as we know it, we're all going to be forced to deal a little bit more with who we are and the way in which we see the world and the communities we live in, and obviously the larger community of biological entities we share with. Because if we don't, when these catastrophic Earth-orchestrated or human-orchestrated catastrophes occur, of which what's occurring in Japan is both, we will really see the true meaning of community, because if we don't have a community above a certain threshold, it falls apart pretty quickly. I mean, people who saw what happened in after the Katrina hurricane, people just took up arms, and you know, it was like warfare. And if your community is together in any way, when there is catastrophe, people tend to pull together, sharing and pooling resources, sharing a tractor. So we'll see that as time moves on, we get into more and more critical times of being forced to share, and being forced, most importantly, to take self-responsibility. And of course, the cultures of this land, the original cultures, encoded within the way in which they interact with each other is right relationship and self-responsibility. In fact, the idea of custodianship from an original people's perspective runs counter to ownership, because with ownership you have rights, but with custodianship you actually have responsibilities. So when we wake up to realize we don't own our partners, we don't own our children, we don't own the earth, when we realize we're custodians, then we move into a new relationship, and that relationship is more about responsibility. And so now, because our times have moved to maximum loss of responsibility, we're now hopefully at the end of that pendulum, and I believe we are, where we're going to swing back to taking back self-responsibility. Hence the rise of the slow food movement and the organic growers movement and the sovereignty movement. These are all movements being propagated by the swarming internet qualities, where people are banding together and ideas of what they know are true are coming to the surface. And we're going to see a lot of this pretty soon. Or more.
We'd like to talk about the nature of custodianship as the same thing that happens when you feel for the land so much that you embed magnetically in it, and plasma-wise it actually becomes your body. You feel it because you've embedded in it, and that's responsibility. Then you're feeling the circulation in charge. You're feeling the circulation of charge in the land as if it's your own body.
Yeah. And so what we're going to see is that the body itself is the most advanced piece of biotech wetware that we can conceive of. And if only we had the right operating instructions, we would already have achieved some of the most incredible feats that we're building our technology to achieve. So an example would be, you know, maybe we started walking, and then very soon maybe someone learned how to ride a horse, moving on to wheels, horse and carts, cars, well, you know, planes, spaceships. But of course, all of the direction of this building of technology moves towards a point. And at that point, we learn how to bilocate. We learn how to dissolve the body and make it reappear somewhere else. And of course, this is frictionless, totally inexpensive, with full integrity, doesn't wreck the environment, so on and so on. Same with telecommunications. You know, we're starting maybe with a couple of tin cans and a string, moving on to telephony and telegraphs, mobile telephony. If you draw that line into the future, you have full telepathic communication, which is broad spectrum, broadband, delivering emotional, pictorial, and the most amazing communication, multimedia communication that we can imagine, can be transferred between the shareability energy of people. And so,
and that is, not to interrupt, but just how beautiful, if you think of that in electrical terms. Some of it's called mitogenic radiation, where we know the frequencies that allows living cells to communicate. And then you extrapolate that to a living electric plasma field, a fractal or phase conjugate field, and see that as self-organizing. And think about what Jung said, collective unconscious, or Catholics say, the communion of saints. You see, the medium that makes group telepathy possible is the discipline of an electric field that distributes perfectly, called fractal.
Thank you. And so we see that energies like that we've been given, like sexual energy flowing through the body, tends to be the area that's most taboo in Western culture, because of course this is our most powerful access into the driving energy of the body, and people may have had experience of, during lovemaking, having this communication beyond words that has such a broad spectrum of information download. So as we move into these really interesting times, it behooves us to form a really clear communication with the natural world. And in order to do that, the first thing we have to do is start to form a really clear communication with our body. So to develop tools, and there are many out there, from kinesiology and using a pendulum, to actually get an informational feedback system, a biofeedback system, of which I think Dan's worked on some. And this way we can create a new language, a language that we realize, if we look carefully, we have already started learning, but we don't even realize it. Example, silicon technology, computers, mobile phones, we are building an artificial silicon crystal grid, maybe this high off you know, desk height, thousands and thousands of nodes, mainly spread in the Western world because we know who needs it most, connected by wires and silicon cables and wirelessly. And now, if you look at it, we've now set up an artificial crystal grid for this final phase of the flowering of human consciousness. And that's because the human mind doesn't have a very clear, and I'm going to say Western cultural perceptive human mind, doesn't have a clear connection to the heart, which is the driving technology. This is the brain that we need to be able to move into and function from as we approach these times. And so that's reflected in computers and operating systems. And you know, if you look around the room, how many people have learnt words like modem, download, upload, software, desktop? Now these seem to be words that relate to a computer, but in actual fact, when they relate to living systems, we all of a sudden start to all learn a language of communication of light. And so when we start to talk about spirit, we'll no longer talk in vague concepts. We'll actually have clear understandings about how our operating system works. And so technology seems to be a reverse engineering of the most up-to-date understanding of who we are, and then we build it out here as a training wheel to teach ourselves to embody it. And so the Ormies is a type of super tech about teaching us ourselves about reconnecting to our original flow of prana, which comes from an unlimited source. And so as we learn about free energy, what we're really learning is about free energy. When we're building Tesla tech, that's not the point. The point is to teach ourselves about there's an unlimited source of energy that we can all tap into, and taking from that energy does not diminish the energy source. And we'll see that the energy source is the same from the center of an atom to the center of your heart, to the center of the earth, to the center of the sun, to the center of the galaxy. These portals or black holes are all linked, as above, so below. And as we tap into that, we will access this infinite free energy.
I really think Dan's language is very useful here. And with my prejudice to think in electrical engineers' terms, to be most practical about what Dan is saying, you know that the electrosmog in your house causes nausea and failure to digest, and it's pretty poisonous, actually. Just the 50 cycle from every transformer in your house, your computer, for example. Well, the physics is that that field, called harmonically exclusive, is the opposite of what Dan's calling broad spectral. Medicine knows very clearly that if you take your heart, you check the harmonics, if they're inclusive harmonics, you have an immune system. Where if your heart says just a few harmonics, they know you're dying fast.
Yeah.
So if we applied that physics to the design of the electric field in your house, you would never, ever put 50 cycle alone in there, because you know that's deathly. Because it's the opposite of charge distribution efficiency, which is exactly what Dan is talking about. So what a fractal field is, perfect distribution of charge, is exactly what biology merges toward, and what our electrical engineers need to understand to make life.
Precisely.
So linking up with what you're saying there, Dan, the actual power grid itself is very detrimental to our natural functioning and what it is that we're meant to be doing in terms of anchoring in the universal fractal consciousness.
But the frequency chosen is the voltage. The frequency at which the voltage required to stop the heart is one of the lowest, which means it's relatively pathological. You know, my experience personally is that when I do a lecture, if there's more than 2 power transformers for computers in the front of the room, every woman loses digestion and no one can focus. Very simple. And we understand the physics perfectly, because the plasma field cannot get centripetal. It's very simple.
And so the corollary of that is, if you're unconscious, or your conscious mind is not paying heed to what your unconscious is telling you, it will create more and more scenarios that will seem bleaker and bleaker till you get it. So we've built a grid, an electrical grid, which is a death ray, because the other one wasn't getting our attention, and we need to shift. Do you understand? So, you know, we're seeing it as they doing all of this out there to us, but that is just because that's our reflection.
I would agree. You can say Dan and we'll both answer. It's all good.
The Dans, or the Danai. So what we need to do is get rid of transcend technology and just, you know, so we don't have to sort of like tap away. We can go into it in a more effective way. I mean, this is what the Aboriginal elders said. They said that consciousness rejected civilization because it's an entrapment.
Yep.
And for all the benefits, you know, your microwave oven, you're still sort of, we're cavemen with microwave ovens basically, rather than shamans in a landscape walking barefoot.
But there's a reason for the way in which things evolve in that way. In other words, we wouldn't have been able to learn the processing power of the frontal cortex by remaining connected to nature in a way that we could download what information we needed as we needed, because then why would you have to develop the intellect? So we had to disconnect as a nation, or as what we're calling Descartesian Western mind, had to disconnect and sever the boundary. We had to cut down the forests so that all the nature spirits went into the ground, in a sense, so that we could disconnect and learn this other process, only to reconnect. If you don't see the reconnection, then it's like we're in a death spiral. But at this stage, Western technology and Western mind will bring a very vital piece of the puzzle back to our ancestors that are still sitting by the fire, holding that frequency of love through nature, but we bringing something else which at the moment is not that easy to see, because all we see is death and destruction related to our pursuit of power and technology.
But if we bring the right deep vision of what a wave does and how mind becomes wave, then when we bring the physics understanding to spirituality and consciousness, we bring a new, deeper self-awareness to inhabiting the field. So,
right. And so what we see here is that the body is actually perfectly designed as an in-out portal. Our perceptive awareness, other than our 5 senses, but including, is able to pick up such a vast range of subtle energetics that we can sense and feel so much, and yet our conscious awareness may only be aware of less than 1%. Our body is super sensitive and capable of picking up all this bioelectromagnetic energy that we're swimming in. And so whether it's TV signals or radio signals or what people are thinking or what earthquake's about to occur, we get all of it. And of course, this could be overwhelming from the mind's perspective, and so it filters. But because of the way in which we brought up, it filters in a very specific way. And so we may end up being throwing away vital information about this food that we just ate is poisoning us. We may not be connected to the mechanism, and so we may poison ourselves. So how do we wake up in the sea of electromagnetic information and make valuable sense of it to enrich our lives here on earth without being overwhelmed? And one of the ways in which we do this is a process of shifting the cognition from purely in the mind to the heart mind, which is 65% neural tissue, and then using these two in conjunction to navigate. And so there's a whole bunch of what we would call technologies, which are actually body technologies that people have learnt from lucid dreaming, remote viewing, which are direct perceptive ways of seeing the world without having to qualify it by the senses, which is a scientific rationalist breaking down. But it enables us to do something like remote viewing, where we can tune into a part of ourselves and actually travel to other parts, not only other parts of the world, but any dimension, in any time, from the micro to the macro, and bring back valuable information. Now this is what a shaman practices to become a shaman, and a healer practices to become a healer, and an artist practices to become an artist. It's going to that place where what we're seeing may be beyond words, being able to be awake enough to experience what it is we're seeing and bring back that, and often that is beyond words and so has to be expressed as music, painting, healing. And then that is the way in which we anchor those high frequencies of energy using our body as a bridge or portal in this dimension. And what we find is that the body is actually perfectly designed to do this. We can walk and talk. And in Africa they say if you can walk and talk, you can sing and dance.
And it relates to the science we teach that the amount of electrical coherence in your aura or plasma is what you take with you when you dream and when you die. So this idea of getting a big aura by attracting charge by thinking a shareable thought means that you're building that ability, that apparatus, to take perception with you when you dream and when you die. It's physically the coherence of that plasma field. Did you?
So Dan, are you then saying that that in living at this level of coherence or awareness or high frequency, does that automatically replace the lower mind field that the child was programmed with, all in the unconscious, all these patterns and emotional belief systems that the person is programmed with and still holds in the body, in the unconscious? Are you saying that just rising to this higher frequency will automatically dissolve all that?
No. What it does is it makes you aware of it, and then you have to form a practice to dissolve it. But because you're dissolving in the direction of your true nature, it's always easier. So that's why often it takes a while to heal, because you may have taken an exponentially longer time to get in that state. But what it does is the realization of it is maybe instantaneous. You know, being able to have a flash of, oh, this is a pattern that I've got from my mother and she got from her father, etc., down the lineage. So seeing that may take a moment. But then we have to actually do the neural pathwork rewiring. And so what that takes is practice. So if you remember Karate Kid, he goes wax on, wax off. What he's doing is he's doing an action repetitively again and again. And what that's doing is it's building a new neural pathway. So that when the time comes for him to be in a fight, he doesn't think, oh, I have to block this punch because then it would be too late. He automatically makes that movement and is shocked by his body because his body has practiced that. And it's the exact same with mental program or Pavlovian response. You already have built up Pavlovian responses in so-called the negative. And to build them in the positive, you have to have the realization and practice until they are embodied. Because as your emotional energy shifts between bliss, joy, happiness, mild depression, deep depression, paranoia, when you start to hit these emotional states, which are called hell realms, then what happens is anything that's not embodied, that was your practice but hadn't been embodied, you revert back to the old way, the old path you knew. So
are you saying then that the process is to forgive our history? To forgive means to replace with, to forgive our past, our old emotional patterns by consciously replacing them with the new programming through?
Not necessarily. That may be a tool. The forgiving, the very idea of forgiving, is the idea that there is something to forgive.
No, the word forgive means to give forth, to replace with.
Right.
To replace the old programs with.
And in a sense, no. All you're doing is you're wiping clean the old programs. You're not replacing them because the body program that is already there is super aware. You've got to remember your body has evolved over billions of years, and not just one lineage, two. Your mother and your father line are both billions of years long. And so the body is billions of years of really high frequency consciousness. And the avatar, the soul being that's inhabiting the body while you're here on earth, is also immortal.
I'd just like to suggest also that the psychological discussion here is very beautiful, but again, with my prejudice to electrical engineering, I feel that electrical engineering language can make this psychological language even more penetrating. For example, when you say to live in a higher frequency, we know by measurement that when you think about somebody you love, if you actually feel it, the number of harmonics in your heart ascends. It's called ascension. It's actually harmonic inclusiveness. So your heart actually generates higher frequencies very measurably when you feel love. And if you chose to stay in that state, your heart is more harmonic inclusiveness, which is how your doctor defines your immune system.
Are you talking about heart math?
No, I taught them how to measure EKG, but they misunderstood the measurement of coherence.
Electromagnetic field of...
No, it's called the power spectrum of the EKG. I taught them how to do it, and that's what we did with my heart tuner. But we did a lot more. We actually measured heart coherence with the cepstrum. It's kind of a long story. Maybe we'll show some examples later. But the point is simple. Harmonic inclusiveness means the high frequencies are present in your heart. So to live in the higher frequencies literally means to relax in a field that's more fractal or inclusive.
Yep.
And just to finish the thought about forgiveness, that if you find something in past pain which actually contributes to present awareness, what you're doing is finding that part of the wave that was shareable, which is to say, to embed in it is to forgive it. So you distill from the pain something that benefited all, which is a wave that was so distributable it's fractal. So literally, forgiveness can be precisely defined by understanding how a field embeds in what's fractal and therefore able to distribute the plasma called mind.
And it heals backwards and forward in time.
And that's time reversal is described in phase conjugation. I mean,
And that's
the physics fits.
And that's what we were kind of alluding to, that it's perspective, you know, the hurt that you created, that you may have felt guilt for in the past, when you come to a different seeing, you see that that was perfectly orchestrated to get you where you got to, so that you can look back and go, oh, that's why I was abused as a child or fell and skinned my knee or whatever it was. And then from that moment of realization, you heal backwards in time and forwards in time because you no longer carry that as a charge to pass on. So cultivating spheroid awareness is this idea of transferring our idea of consciousness, which is quite flat and planar, into a spheroid. And spheroid is just an approaching a round dish type of shape. It can be egg shape. In fact, it's more likely egg shape.
Or maybe
or torus. And what this means is that this Lotus temple, being the place it is, wisely chose to build this building directly over the center of the earth. Now that's pretty amazing in a flat plane. But in a spherical plane, there is no place on this earth that is not directly over the center of the earth. And so from this we can extrapolate that we may awaken one day to realize that we are the chosen one, and so is everyone else at the same time, because of spheroid awareness. And so this is very important, because when we start to interact with each other, if we don't have this spheroid type idea of how we all linked, then what happens is we very easily start to create hierarchies, and through that hierarchy or spiritual superiority, we may think we have something that is better than the other, and yet it's impossible. It's impossible within this realm.
Well, just to suggest maybe a really disciplined way to think about that, in a hologram, the way in which every point contains information about the whole, every other point, is called coherence. But the perfect form of coherence is fractal, which is where compression is perfect. That means you can be part of that hologram of the spherical awareness best if the electric field looks like a rose, called fractal. That actually fractality is the way to understand that multi-connected topology, because it's where compression allows one point to contain the all.
I'm going to go back to this torus here. And if you note the torus shape, these are blood cells here. And so your blood is a torus shape. Now the magical thing about the torus shape, which Dan probably went into a fair amount, is that the very shape of it allows it to move through space-time
inside out,
frictionless,
to implode and to suck in charge, and therefore to choose direction, like a Medusa or a jellyfish. So if you can implode, if you can suck in charge, then you can steer.
Not only steer, this shape happens to be the shape that can store the maximum amount of information in the smallest amount of space.
Because it superposed 3 axes of rotating spin.
That's right. So we find that this shape actually occurs around the human body, around the planet, around the solar system, around the galaxy. In fact, all what we call physical systems will have this energetic shape around it because of the way in which they were built from the same source that was building them, which is the same shape around the energy field around your heart or your body, because we're all built out of the same thing. Let's call it light for the moment, or love. Then everything is built to that plan.
If everything is ether or charge, a way to think about it is to say, if you're a smoker made out of smoke, the only thing you can make is smoke rings, and there's no other shape available.
And so what we see here is a picture of this tribe here is the Hemba, and they've covered their body in ochre. And ochre is essentially rust. What gives it that color is its iron oxide that's rusting. And the center of the iron molecule is iron, the blood molecule is iron too. And iron has a very interesting quality in the way in which it can be magnetized. And so what happens is, because of the sea of electromagnetic information that we're swimming in is constantly giving us signals, it's through the blood that we can record these signals. And not only record them, we can relay them within our body context and then broadcast where we're at with it. So the slide I put up earlier about the body's multi-track system means that you were an aerial in this electromagnetic field. So every shape that you make with your body, you're changing the waves that you receive. And so yoga takes on a new meaning, or body postures or ecstatic body postures in shamanism, because by the very changing of your shape of your body, you are picking up different signals. But then that aerial is more subtle than that, because what you think changes the shape and permeability of your aura. And so then everything you think and everything you do, every shape you make with your body, changes the channel you tune to. Ochre increases the potency of that signal. It amplifies the signal. If you put ochre on your body and go dance at a sacred site in a particular way, you're increasing it many, many fold, and so hence you're in touch with the ancestors. And so you look through many tribes, they've used ochre. And then each organ in the body will measure through your blood and through the level of the signal it's picking up, what level you are picking that signal up and what level you're at and putting it out. For example, the heart may measure the level of compassion, your kidneys may measure the level of fear, your liver may measure the level of anger that you're receiving, and if you can transmute it, you'll be putting out a low level, and if not, you will put out an equally potent or higher level, and that will become destructive in your body. And so when Maya Baba said, "Don't worry, be happy," he wasn't joking, or he was.
But we talked about this slide from Danny when at the Starseed too, because when Bentoff taught the physics of Kundalini, it was about the fact that the Aboriginal walked 1,000 miles to get the right kind of ochre paint. It's called Ochre Cove on the Bight in South Australia, and he painted that on his body. And how far the ochre paint went on his body for the shaman was a map of how far the Kundalini had progressed, meaning what part of his body was radiating this strong microwave magnetic, and therefore how big were the tornadoes he could steer. So you saw by where the ochre pass was, and that's actually in the book on the physics of Kundalini, the ochre paint on the face. And if you map that to the acupuncture and the grids of the body, you actually see that iron paint is actually making the waveguide, not just for magnetics and microwave, but all the field effect by which your body is steering the environment. I think there was somebody, John, did you want to say something?
Yeah. What about the soul shapes, like this, the donut form of the blood and that seems to be one soul shape, and then the Pharaoh's helmet or the pericardium, it's another soul shape that's got the two ostrich feathers on, meaning this is steering. So does this round thing go along like it?
Well, the story was that, again, in the physics of Kundalini, Osiris's hat is the geometry of the heart pericardium. It's like an offset. And the fact is, if you develop the muscles to control the shape of your pericardium, then you can control the direction by which your fractal heart creates thrust and gravity and steers you when you dream and when you die. That's called coherent emotion. So if you can choose coherent emotion, you now have controls of the muscles of your pericardium, that's what your EKG measures. The same way the muscles of your eyeball determine whether you can focus your eye, the same with your heart.
So is the donut just like a cross-section, like this is the elevation,
of the
and
pericardium.
then the donut, there's a cross-section of that.
And the heart's voltage is often modeled as a donut inside a donut. In fact, you know, the nesting, the perfect embedding. This is the way the book on the physics of the origin of heart muscle, the animation on the cover of the book, When Time Breaks Down, is this, which is called embeddability. So the more your heart learns to nest little waves inside big waves implosively, the more your heart feels bliss and your aura gets big, because you get one of these nested in them. And so that's the process of fractal embedding.
Is that increasing our electromagnetic field, the donut
Precisely.
shape around us?
Precisely. Right. And that shows up in the harmonics of your EKG when you feel love, because you got more donuts.
So when we're sitting in our head and we're stuck in all our emotions, we're at a lower level of electromagnetic field compared to when we're sitting within our heart?
No, the heart is actually the drum beat that then organizes the ventricle liquids of the brain. So if your heart's not organized, your brain can't get organized. But it really takes both to finish the implosive process. And that's, you know, in the appendix to Stalking the Wild Pendulum on the biomechanics of Kundalini, how the low frequencies of the EKG determine whether the spine liquid pump delivers the bliss here, which then shows up in the brainwave power spectrum. We might show some of those slides later, but
Sorry, was that a book you just mentioned?
Stalking the Wild Pendulum, the biomechanics of Kundalini by Ben Bentoff, who was my teacher.
And then if you see the way cells develop from an early stage, which I could probably show you a little bit.
That top knot in Buddha, you know, it's that sort of top knot.
Yep.
That's right. It's like a little pine cone, the way his hair is braided.
Yeah. So that's sort of like connects an isomorphic relationship between the Buddhist form and the pharaonic form.
Good point, yes. And a lot of ladies wear their hair that way. Go ahead.
Of course, like looking at different levels of the subtle energy, if you're looking at the subtle body and you could see the meridians, they would make a shape of the body, and then the kind of egg shape, subtle body around that, and then the torus shape is actually on the next subtle level beyond that. And so it's not like there's one or the other. They all actually exist embedded within each other, and they all interface. So the nervous system interfaces with the meridians as you move deeper through the soft tissues. You know, the blood system, the soft tissues, the bone. The bone is like crystal.
So they're all shape-shifting.
Yeah.
The plasma.
And of course crystals form along lines of clarity. Clarity of ideas, clarity of thought, clarity of belief. So the way a bone forms is you've got osteoblasts and osteoclasts. They're building bone, and one's taking apart bone all the time. And so if you stop using your muscles, which create tension, then the bones start to go into softness because there's no tension for them to keep growing along the signs of tension, and you get osteoporosis. And so osteoporosis is as much not using your muscles as it is not having the nutritional backup to keep the bones built. And so the bones are formed along the line of most use of your muscles, and so they're constantly changing. And if you have a bad habit of the way in which you walk or sit, then over time your bones can create bad posture, and the bones can actually start to change. But they're the last line of moving in from these subtle bodies into the solid bodies, and why they're used in so much ceremony with old world cultures with the bones. And of course the skull and crossbones became the Templars' symbol, because they're the last bones to break down once you're buried. The big thigh bones and the skull bones. But there's another reason, and Dan knows this reason too, is as we walk along the song lines, we're walking along waves of electromagnetic energy, and the sacrum at the top of where these bones meet is where that charge comes in and enters like a serpent, and serpents up the spinal column. And if you have a clear system, when it reaches this part unfolds like a brain with wings, and hence the caduceus. And so the skull and the crossbones are not only a symbol of immortality, they are a symbol of being able to be connected heaven to earth.
And the physics of how that longest wave ever stored in biologic memory, the calcium in bone, is actually a piezoelectric helix. And then they would grind up those bones of their ancestors and drink them.
Yep.
The skull and crossbones was actually the maritime flag of the Templars.
Yep.
And it was the flag of the navigator.
Yep.
And they would navigate, you're quite right, but it was the shin bones, because it's the shin bones, the memory of all of the places we've trod. So that when you walk the magnetic lines, it stores in the shin bones, and that was why they used those, because it was the navigator's flag. Works in the ocean as well as the...
Right, and that navigation you're talking about, that psycho-navigation, that's exactly one of the direct perceptive tools used by the first and original pirates, which were the boogies, the boogeymen from Indonesia. And they would navigate by literally a type of astral travel. So they didn't need compasses or to navigate by the stars. That's just our idea of what we thought they had to have.
But your phase relationship to stars is something that you do feel in your bones. I feel it in me bones, matey.
True.
And by the way, that book, Psycho-Navigation, by that title, is very useful in that
John
regard.
Perkins.
Which is a way of navigating into a lucid dream as well, which is a map of the stars inside your plasma.
So all of these abilities of direct perception relate to us using a head and heart connection. And so what happens is when the egg is fertilized, which is a whole interesting process I'm not going to go into at the moment, but it divides into 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. It reaches about 512 cells, and I think at that stage it's called a blastula. And at that stage,
Turns inside out, becomes a
Turns
donut.
inside out.
It's called the 7 stages of invagination, or perfect dimpling.
yeah, and at that stage, it starts to pulse. All the cells synchronize, and at that stage, that's the development of the heart. So at one stage in time, we're all just a heart, and we start to pulse. And the next thing that develops is the tip of the tongue, which is interesting, because in yogic practice, many different lineages of yoga, when you cycle the energy in the body, be it in Tantra or yoga, and it rises up the spine and comes up over the top of the head, to cycle it, it comes down and to the top of the palate, soft palate. And in order to connect it, you place the tongue on top of the palate, and that reconnects the circuit, back through the heart and back down into the hara.
And the reason that drips with the sweetness of the nectar of bliss is actually your body is informing you that the circuit is completed. And the sweetness of nectar you taste actually is fabricated in the center of the rose of the flowering brain, which actually is a harmonic rich. It's the molecule that's most fractal. It's compression perfected, the rose.
And so this process of the brain is already hardwired and connected to the heart through the brain stem, and this is mostly unconscious. There's a constant amount of information moving between the heart and the brain, the pineal pituitary complex at the center of the brain, issuing a cascade of hormones affecting all our bodily functions and certain levels of consciousness. And so this is an unconscious connection. When we make a conscious connection with the tongue on the top of the mouth, we're actually making a conscious connection between heart and mind. And this means it's engaging the heart in a whole new way, a way in which it's designed to function. And this is a technique of practicing all these direct perceptive methods to do things like psycho-navigation and shape-shifting and remote viewing, or whatever you want to call it, telepathic communication, bilocation. These are all accessed by creating a vortex or tuning into that black hole in the center of the heart.
And just in practical terms, the way that Bentoff measured the Kundalini was the phase lock of the low frequencies of the heart, called HRV, which is your breathing. And that is the snake charm of the spine liquid pump, sacrocranial, which is the delivery system of amygdala to high brain, called Kundalini. So in effect, as you control your breathing, your heart is then regulating the cerebrospinal fluid to phase lock, and that's called getting horny. Your ventral horns crystallize. And actually the conserved sexual juices begin to project, like Lucifer and Moses' horns and all that bit. So the biomechanics of Kundalini, called bliss, is actually a detailed description of how you take conscious control of that black hole in your heart, starting with your breath.
And that's why this can be used as a way to tune into when we are in sync or in harmony, is we recognize beauty and we feel bliss. So the orgasm is our body telling us that we are making a connection, a harmonic connection. When we see beauty in nature, the reason we see that is because that is perfected over time and space, and because we recognize the aspects of our being that are that, they seem beautiful.
And what you're calling beauty is the ability to perfectly embed in something because it's fractal, where charge distribution is so perfect that presence of mind in it is a perfect field effect, perfectly embeddable. So you won't fall in love with square metal buildings. You won't see them as beautiful because they don't fit the physics of an embeddable field. So embeddability is actually the description of beauty.
And it's no coincidence that as we rise in frequency on that emotional spectrum, as you approach levels of happiness or very happy, then what happens is you recognize more beauty. Same as you move into the levels of mild depression or deep depression or paranoia, not only does everything become ugly, it becomes malignant and poisonous. And so the disturbed mind, which becomes paranoid or deeply depressed, is actually looking out at and seeing the extreme conspiracy, how everything is against you personally.
This is what Gregory Bateson called Steps to an Ecology of Mind in the book by that title.
Right.
But somebody wanted to say it's okay.
Right.
I read a book years ago by Colin Wilson,
Yep.
Origins of the Sexual Impulse,
Right.
which I thought was a classic book. And he talks about the fetish. He says everybody's basically a fetishist of some sort or another. There's the object, the circumstances in which an orgasm can occur, the sort of the coordinates that you require to sort of for that moment to occur. And he makes the point that Freud says no one's born with a specific orientation, and that it's socialised. That was the Freudian position. I mean, there may be some room for a revision there. And so he talked about the revision of it, and he said he looked at various behaviours of people. And he said one character was sort of, he was a bit alienated due to negative experiences that had occurred, and he was a heterosexual guy, and he got down to basically his attraction to the female genitals got down to a symbolism. He could get turned on by a triangle, and that's all that he required. A triangle would get him off, and so he becomes so abstracted from a sort of more organic, connected type of a thing. So Wilson's idea was that the entrapment in fetish, which is a way of controlling people. Here are the images of what's beautiful. You get addicted to that, and then at an early age, before you can make filters and judgments. So they've got you, and they'll see anything. With,
I have a feeling what you're talking about there is there's different types or levels of orgasm.
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
and what you're talking about, the whole fetish side is related to fantasy.
Yeah.
And that's actually related to like a more serotonin type orgasmic thing. In other words, you come in your mind for the cosmic oxytocin type orgasm of the experience of bliss, which is your natural state of being, is not guided by that same wave. It's a different wave. And
Well, I think a way you might say something in the science term there, if you look at Wilhelm Reich's book, Function of the Organism, he says, well, if you have orgasm, you're not going to have cancer because your cell gets to distribute the ultraviolet. But he didn't have a clue, of course, that urge to distribute plasma, which is functionally why boys learn football, because they didn't get to kiss any girls, so they need football. It's called testosterone poisoning, right? The fact is they had no place to distribute their plasma, which is the urge to distribute, the urge to fetish, as it were. Whereas if you really know where that urge to project plasma can go, instead of simply what is the conventional orgasm, but not that it's bad, but ultimately it climbs to a much longer wave where the ultraviolet goes up the tailbone as a straw, and that's what sacrocranial kundalini is, which is a much longer wave, larger field effect, planetary.
burn.
Just what you're saying about the oxytocin, etc., which sort of gets a wave mechanic to what you're just saying.
But it seems like the sort of paranoid states that you talk about, where people get down to that point of everyone's against me. I think at that state, we're in fright, flight, and fight. Everything's locked off, and you're locked with fetishes that you don't get a chance to sort of like with consciousness work out or evolve away from. So everything's sort of like tight, and we have a world based on advertising, which is fright, flight, and fight world.
But
advertising.
But if you live in nature, you can relax into a much longer wave.
That's right.
Because the field is more fractal.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean a city can't be fractal, it just means we haven't invented one yet.
And of course, this is what I believe Buddha was talking about when he was talking about desire and suffering, because and Joseph Campbell alluded to in some of his talks about art, saying that a lot of what the West was calling art was actually called pornography, which by the Supreme Court definition was something that made you want or not want, the desire. So all advertising is pornography, because it makes you want the product that they're trying to sell you, or not want this other thing, the product they're not trying to sell you. And so art was then not so much a thing out here, but this beautiful nectar that your being held for you at the time to be able to perceive stuff. And so when you perceived an external reflection, a harmonic reflection, you went into awe. It wasn't, "Ooh, that's great, I've got to have it," or it was just like, wow. So nature is in that realm of wowness because it's art, it's living art, and it's a reflection of beauty because it's reflecting who you are. not who you think you have to be in order to get the love, which is different. And so all of that other art, what we were calling art, which is pornography, is what we think we have to do in order to get the love, and so we shift our idea or pervert our idea of who we think we are in order to be loved. But if we were taught that the source of love is within ourselves, we wouldn't be fucking for the love. You know, we would be interacting, we already have the love. We would be making love, which is different.
It's lovely to think that, you know, a practical application of this could be teenagers don't need to have premature pregnancies if they've been taught art, because in fact they learned how to distribute their aura as plasma, and therefore they don't have that requirement to distribute it prematurely and inappropriately. So the ability to be in a longer wave depends on an environment which is called touch permissive or fractal. So patriarchy has invented this problem by preventing teenagers from actually having touch permissive behaviors in part.
So how do we touch the earth in a way that makes it more fertile?
Permissive, fractal, charge distribution, non-destructive touch, compression that's perfect.
Can I ask a question, sort of in relation to this, and also what Dan said earlier? Right now, around the world, there's a huge amount of fear. It has to do with radiation. And earlier, Dan said that if we put our intention that we can shift or protect ourselves from the nuclear radiation. Would you give an understanding, intention on what or intention how? Because it's a personal journey, either one of you. I mean, Dan, you may be able to explain what he said clearly.
You know, Leyland said he was at Bhopal when all those thousands of people died. But we also know that the families that practiced Agnihotra mostly did not die. We know what Agnihotra is.
What?
If you light the flame in the dish that's a phase conjugate capacitor at the precise angle of the sun that's perpendicular, you implode conjugate and you make an aura which is self-organizing, restoring not just fertility to the farm, but actually eliminating the poisons, in this case Bhopal, or radiation. So in effect, you make a centripetal field with your intention, with your paramagnetic garden that's shaped like a rose, with the geometry of your dolmen, with the fact that your community looks like a rose. All of that stuff makes a centripetal field. That's the skin that self-organizes, which is compression, which protects against and is the opposite of radioactivity.
You maintain the
individual.
What's that?
And number two, what about just the individual? What can they do? Not in building their...
Okay, the individual
Yeah.
that you're talking about doesn't exist. Because there's only you, right? There's seemingly lots of other people around, but they may just be reflections of you. So because you have the unique perspective that you have, within the body you have to go, is this radiation affecting me? Not, is that radiation affecting a Japanese person living next to the nuclear reactor, because they have chosen through their incarnated line to be there for a different way of seeing the world altogether. So we have to say, how do I protect myself against radiation if I happen to be in a radioactive space, but you're not, and so you may not necessarily have the tools. So posing the hypothetical questions can actually get us into a lot of philosophical quagmire. So that for me, it's a very simple thing. As things approach me and come into my field, I'm forced to deal with them, and I assume that they are orchestrated to be exactly as the way they are, because I assume that there's an orchestrating principle creating this living matrix for all of us at the same time. So whatever's happening for me may be happening for you, but the way in which you experience it is totally different. So you could go online and research 101 foods which will protect the body from radiation. For example, Steiner mentioned that if you eat biodynamically grown produce, it protects the body from radiation. Wilhelm Reich used a teeny little spike of radium in one of his cloudbusters to dissipate radiation, and at first they used too much and they created the opposite, and in fact people got cancer